Today, I will deal precisely with the status of anthropology as a science during its institutionalization in the 19th century and the connection to photography. And I want to consider the anthropology's inherent duality between two knowledge domains and how this was reflected in the doubleness of the photographic discourses. So I will refer mainly to material coming from Italian anthropological archives and primary sources, mainly the Florentine Museum of Anthropology and Ethnology and the Pigorini Museum of Ethnography in Rome. My research is concerned with the colonial system and culture that informed the making of anthropology. However, for today's discussion, I will just marginally touch upon it, as I would like to deepen issue related to the method of anthropology from within, to see how the new community of experts defined its scope and how they framed the research objects. So I would like to start with a quotation by Paolo Mantegazza, who was one of the founders of Italian anthropology. The first Museum of Anthropology and Ethnology and Society were founded in Florence in 1869. And before that, in 1853, Mantegazza already underlined a crucial gap. He said, there are animal and botanical iconographies that can be considered works of art, but there is not yet a human iconography that could make the synthesis between the studies of men of letters who, unaware of anatomy, take the only path of linguistics and history, and that of physicians who, worshippers of raw and nude material, struggle to make ethnography on skulls, skin, and hair. So the issue at stake here are two that interest me. So one is to provide a synthesis between two approaches, and these two approaches are, on the one hand, that of the man of letters, the point of view of linguistics and history, as he framed it, and on the other hand, anatomy, physician, raw material. And the other thing is that this synthesis should be provided visually through a visual method that it calls human iconography. So we will revolve around these two crucial concepts during this presentation. And it's interesting that Mantegazza used the word iconography, but it seems to be very close to the idea of atlas. And as Gaston and Gallison have shown, atlases represented very specific objects of scientific dissemination that teach to see, to select, and to sort, teach how to see the essential and overlook the incidental in the making of a scientific domain. And so pictures served as instructors of the eye because they show what the object of study was and which visual methodologies should be used to isolate it. So I'm interested in the connection between the definition of disciplinary boundaries and the visualization of the disciplinary objects, and to see how anthropology struggled in this definition, negotiating between epistemic and visual approaches. So let's start from this idea of a synthesis and this idea of different epistemic approaches. I have chosen these two quotes to exemplify parallel purposes and attempts in Italian anthropology at the end of the 19th century. One is by Enrico Morselli from 1884, and he said, the method used today for the study of man is essentially experimental, since anthropology is part of natural and biological science. So the instruments and the investigation process used by anthropologists are not different from those of the anatomist, the physiologist, the naturalist. So on the one hand, anthropology claimed its scientificity and its belonging to the natural science paradigm. But on the other hand, we can read from this 1873 article by Mantegazza, Giglioli, and Letourneau, where they say anthropology has to pass from the static to the dynamic period, since anthropologists would not indefinitely want to limit themselves to classify man as botanists classify plants in his herbarium. Anthropology, without abandoning compass and scale, without neglecting human morphology, had to force itself in showing the acting thinking and living man. So in this quotation, a purely botanical model is rejected, and they call it for a further step to move beyond the static measuring and classificatory intent of anthropology and to enter a space that has something to say about the dynamic quality of human life. So these were tensions, but also parallel development within anthropology in the making. And now let's see how photography entered into this conversation. As part of the discourses promoting photography as a reliable tool of documentation, as a useful tool to close the space between colonial peripheries and scientific centers of interpretation, I would like to deepen a specific definition that appeared for the first time in 1873 and then was taken back in 1881 and in 1884. So here Giglioli and Zanetti, in Instructions for Travelers, in a chapter dedicated to anthropology, said that from the scientific point of view, the man must be photographed in front and profile in the position that we have recommended for measurements. And this definition is taken back by Enrico Morselli in 1884, that says that how to proceed to photograph a man scientifically. From the anthropological point of view, the man has to be portrayed in front and profile in a size big enough so that light can capture every detail of the physiognomy. So this is clearly linked to the idea of anthropometry. So the idea, and it's this proposal about the use of photography is in line with the mechanical objectivity paradigm. Anthropometric photography should ideally produce, through a standardized protocol, a set of measurable and comparable visual data. And this kind of representation enabled in the positivist conception the possibility to build a human taxonomy, assess the belonging of a specific race, and theorize related hierarchy, influences, and affiliation. And as Deborah Paul has underlined, this strict protocol was connected to the management of the photographic access to control the medium's ability to capture also unintended details. And so this whole protocol of measuring, lighting, standard pose, neutral background were put in place as a way to control this excessive quality of the photographic medium. And indeed, when we look into anthropological archives, we see how rarely anthropometric and typological pictures were present according to the proposed theoretical standards, and how often pictures gives information instead of the photographic encounter, the photographic performance in the field, the negotiations between photographers and photographed. And this unsuccess of anthropometry has to do, on the one hand, with the resistance, for example, from the side of the sitters, and also with the distance between theory and practice. But it also has something to do with the fact that anthropologists were looking for something else beyond bodily classification. So let's come back to our definition that continues as follows. To this kind of scientific photography, it should be added an artistic one that gives the natural behavior, the personality of the individuals and the race. Or again, in the 1884 reframing by Enrico Morselli, to scientific pictures, it would be useful to add artistic ones, namely taken with the natural and free attitude of the portrayed subjects, possibly in their traditional costumes and surrounded by tools and utensils typical of the region and social class. So if in the scientific photography, we were confronted with the standardized anthropometric request with indication about lighting and measuring, here we find a loose definition with ambiguous formula. They write about natural behavior, free attitude. They bring in notions of personality or typicality that should apply both to the individuals and to the group, to the individuals, the race, the region, the social class, as we read. So as a first reactions, also looking at the pictures that I have placed next to the definition, we can of course say that this artistic idea of photography was as staged as a scientific one. And we may say that it still plays with the idea of the type, but in a logic of inclusion and addition of all the interesting, traditional, typical elements, as opposed to a logic of exclusion and subtraction of disturbing influences that were at the basis of anthropometry. But I would also like to discuss how this second definition somehow answers a different need. And here I move from Deborah Paul's concept of excess to Elizabeth Edwards' reframing of it with the idea of abundance. I argue that, although struggling in the definition, what these 19th century authors tried to convey was the possibility to bring to focus within the photographic frame a person within its cultural context, to make visible an invisible system of meanings that links people, behavior, customs, objects. So within the archive, if we try to look for representation that could fall into this idea of artistic photography, we can include, for example, these carefully constructed studio photography that were made by professionals, such as the Linz pictures that you can find on the right, where the sitter is basically overwhelmed by objects inserted to perform the image of the noble and decaying savage for the Western viewer. So it's a clearly constructed pictures. On other cases that may fall into this definition are instead pictures produced by field ethnographer that brings into focus the subjective choices and the modification of the context led by their presence in the field. So, for example, in the pictures on the top left, it's a picture by Elio Modigliani taken in the Nias Island in Indonesia, and this picture was inserted in his book, and he wrote how he forgot to leave, he forgot his luggage on the corner of this house, and so he's showing directly and also explicitly stressing to the reader that he was present there and that he modified this space somehow. While on this other picture on the right, these are taken in a mission to Eritrea that was promoted by the Colonial and the Anthropological Society in 1905. And these are Kodak prints where you see this shadow of the photographers that you also mentioned yesterday, this idea of the explorer being present in the field and showing his presence as a valuable element. But the relationship between art and science was not just that of a pacific coexistence within anthropology, and in this case, I would like to mention a clash between art and science. These are pictures that were taken by Guido Boggiani, who was an Italian painter that he later abandoned his career and traveled to Brazil and to the Gran Chaco area, and he started developing publication and studies about the Caduvei population. These are actually just to I'm not going that much into the details of the materiality of these objects, but these are postcard versions that were made by a German anthropologist later, by Lehmann Nitsch, later on using the photographs by Boggiani. But the book by Boggiani was heavily criticized by Mantegazza precisely because of its unscientific approach. And he said that especially his illustrations were too vague, too artistic, too impressionistic. And Boggiani replied in a letter to Mantegazza, distancing himself from ethnography and claiming instead its autonomous identity as an artist. So in this case, the the connection between art and science is a bit different. I'm about to conclude now. I just would like to stress how interesting is that in the anthropological debate, we see this emerging use of the word scientific and artistic photography. And the similar debates were going on also in other national traditions. I'm thinking of the British one, for example. But the labeling as scientific and artistic is interesting to me. And they also, also because they use the same word that were going on within the photography debate. Photography as an art, or as a science, as an aid to science, or as an artistic medium. But also maybe this use of the artistic label was a way to bring inside the boundaries of the anthropological archive series of pre-existing and non-scientific representation that could anyway be helpful to scientists. But I also think that this distinction between scientific and artistic photography reveals the inherent ambiguity of anthropology. Mainly, the discipline oscillated between the possibility to treat humans as specimens and ordering them in taxonomy, or to studying man as living beings in their complex social relationship. And so I hope I have shown how the anthropological discipline moved somehow along this borderline, taking inspiration on the one hand from the natural scientific domain, on the other to the human and social science domain that were not opposed and self-excluding areas, but were two fields of knowledge in the making. And so we see this contrast, but tension also between a quantitative and a qualitative kind of research, between an objective and a subjective method. And I also propose to look at the history of anthropology also with an eye to the continuity rather than just narrating it as a series of turns, because this may show how some crucial question on visualization method existed at the very origin of anthropology. And so to also move beyond the idea of bodily classification and racial classification that was surely present, but that was also accompanied by this intention to size somehow the cultural datum, something that maybe we may term as that, this living quality of the human being. And so this presentation elaborating on this genus-faced nature of anthropological photography, showing how the discipline became a space for maybe experimentation on visualization at the crossroad of natural and social sciences. Thank you very much for your attention.